I think with this revival of the shared pursuit of excellence, the revival of civic duty, we're taking a bet. Right? The bet is this could go actually even worse, right? It's co-opted by the central government as it relates to civic duty. On the excellence side, I'm keep the government out of it. But on the citizen, on the cultivation of the citizen, the civic service, the military service piece of this, the revival of the identity of one as a citizen. Okay, if it's strictly confined to that, we're taking a bet that at least it's within the remit of what a great national leader can still pull off for the future of a nation that can live for the next 250 years as it has for the last 250 years, rather than going the way of the Eastern Roman Empire versus the Holy Roman Empire, which is the direction that I think we're otherwise heading as the American experiment is heading. So I guess I think we're in a zone where we should still be willing to play those odds in a way that I think now it goes from not just designing systems, which is what we've been talking about. I think history is written by a combination of systems and the first personal human beings who then shape that history, to at least have a vision for that system. In this fear of American capitalism and the fear of American democracy, here's the affirmative values that we can revive as a shared, cohering national identity based on excellence, based on civic revival of civic duty, and then bet on the possibility that when America went through its last identity crisis in the late 70s, a leader rose to tie up the pieces, that we might put ourselves in the position for the same thing to happen sometime in the next half decade. Because if it ain't happening in the next half decade, I think the cake is mostly baked, and the best we're going to do as local institutions thereon going forward. The only problem with that, Ben, is that 20 years later, that means that China, the national identity is so shaken at its core that we might, the great-grandkids might all be Chinese slaves in some shape, way, or form, and that we're just waiting for the arrival.
The only thing that prevents that is just the comparative advantage that the capitalistic system has over the communistic system. I mean, China has a lot of weaknesses.
We're not even deriving, but on the trajectory that you described, I'm not even sure we're fully positioned to have those benefits anymore.
I mean, that's quite possible. I mean, I do think that the internal, to sound like a Marxist, I think the internal contradictions of the Chinese system are going to prove unworkable over the course of time, but not before they do an extraordinary amount of actual material military damage.
Yep.
I think that the possibility of China starting to invade sovereign surrounding entities, including Taiwan, is now at an all-time high.
Right.
And I think that it's increasing pretty dramatically day by day because, again, they're looking at the fact that they are reproducing at far less than replacement rate. They're looking at the fact that they have extraordinary structural debt. I think the fact their economic growth has been on paper for quite a while now. And they're realizing that maybe the way to grasp comparative power is to not generate more wealth for themselves, but to decrease the amount of wealth for everybody else.
Exactly. And I think there's a version of this dynamic, it reminds me of the famous Keynes quote or whatever, the market can stay rational longer than you can stay liquid, sort of betting against a phenomenon. That's like the dynamic between China and the United States, militarily speaking, which is that, okay, yes, that gravy train ain't going to be running forever on the Chinese side of this. History teaches us that centrally planned economies and dictatorial systems usually fail under, among other things, even the hubris of their own leaders, which I think is the best chance with Xi Jinping. And they do have their vulnerabilities.
But not before he completely wrecks our economy. I mean, if he invades
maybe even wrecks us
Taiwan,
militarily. I mean, let's just talk about Taiwan for a second, where. So I've sort of started to, I'm not a military expert. I'm not going to claim to be one, but as someone who's looked at this more than the average layperson, I will say that, I've talked to Mike Pence about this. I've talked to, Pompeo, others. I'm sure you've had conversations with many of the same folks. They will tell you, as I believe, that okay, military conflict, we still come out ahead. I think that's what they're supposed to say, but
over Taiwan, if they're saying that we come out ahead short of a full-scale shooting war between the United States and China over Taiwan, I don't think we can stop them from taking Taiwan.
I don't think we should stop them
They're 5 seconds from Taiwan, and we don't have the naval assets available to stop them. It's not. If they choose to take Taiwan, it's just a question of how many casualties they take to take Taiwan.
So I actually agree with you, and I think that we did this exercise of sending the ships through the Taiwanese Strait and sending a signal. The irony, and I think China knows this. I mean, from public information, any reasonable person could piece this together. Our Navy is actually going through an interesting period right now. It's what they call the divest to invest program.
Right.
So they're playing for 30 years from now, but they're actually decommissioning
Yeah, that's right.
ships at an extraordinary rate. And so if you're China, you're watching that. The ultimate irony, I don't know if it's literally true for the 2 ships that went through the Taiwanese Strait, but it might have been. As best I know, if I had to guess, it probably was true. That the moment that China chooses to invade Taiwan, if it's like 6 years from now or 5 years from now, those won't even be the ships. Those ships will have been decommissioned.
Right.
So the irony of like the very exercise we went through to puff our chests like those very carriers will have been retired according to our divest to invest plan for the US Navy in the very time frame that China is actually going to be invading Taiwan. And so I keep going back and forth between a view that I think the window, in any case, I've always said they weren't going to do it before October of this year, because that's when Xi takes his unprecedented third term.
Right.
That's when, it's a big move in China, by the way. He doesn't want to rock the boat to break the chain of succession, which is 2 5-year terms. He's going to take an unprecedented third term. That's a big deal. It's happening like in a month and a half, right? I mean, that's in October. So he was never going to go before then.
He's got to put some W on the board.
Which he's got to put some W on the board, but stability. But stability is the key. I mean, because there's some opposition even within the CCP to this break of tradition. He's not having it. And I've always said that actually now is our window to talk about the unraveling of the Chinese economic calamity. We're going to miss our window to have potentially catalyzed that, because what Xi was doing is he was nuking his own economy. Chinese tech stocks, Jack Ma, silence him, put him to a re-education camp. Chinese tech stocks took $1 trillion plus market capitalization hit because of Xi's desire to aggregate power that superseded even his concern for their economy. So in a certain sense, it's sad we missed our window, because that might have been the moment to actually engage in sort of mutual economic tactics that won't have their same effect afterwards, because Xi previously, right now is a window where he cares about shoring up his power ahead of the transition. After the transition, he's going to be in a much stronger position. But what I've always said is that starts the clock for when China would invade Taiwan. And I still am of the view that if I'm in his shoes, you don't want to take the risk of the next U.S. president possibly taking office in January 2025. And so my armchair geopolitics on this is October 2022 to January 2025 demarcates the window for the likely invasion of Taiwan.
Neil Ferguson was telling me the same thing. I mean, Neil Ferguson, who is a historian and a military historian, I mean, Neil was basically suggesting something
that's the
similar.
window.
Yeah, and especially because if you look at what they're doing with the semiconductors right now, right, reshoring all of the production and manufacturing of more basic semiconductors in China is obviously designed so that if they decide to invade Taiwan and Taiwan microwaves all of its microchips, that guess who's positioned with the number 2 level of microchips.
So the reality on this is interesting. It relates to your point, which is that the central command and control economy model doesn't work as well. Xi actually had a national plan to commission Chinese advancements in semiconductor production. Those have actually, it turns out, not gone very well. How do you know something hasn't gone well in China? When they launch an anti-corruption investigation. That means something hasn't gone well, so they're going to put some people in jail for not actually completing their projects on time and claiming they were corrupt. That's how it works in China. But anyway, actually, I think that the good news is that the bad news is America is not nearly where it needs to be with respect to its own semiconductor supply chain and production capacities and the building of fabs here, fabrication facilities that actually create semiconductors. The good news is neither is China. The bad news, again, though, is if China takes over Taiwan, China sits on TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which is the top provider of chips around the world, and that would be a big incentive for them to take over. And this is where I actually get back to being optimistic about the market. This is, and from an investment perspective, it is staggering to me that the most engaged shareholders in the world, the likes of BlackRock, who will tell Exxon and Chevron that they're going to go the way of the dodo if they don't invest in new clean, $10 billion over 10 years or whatever it is in clean energy technologies and transition away from oil and gas, do not say a peep about the looming risks and opportunities created for American semiconductor manufacturers from onshoring their capacity, from actually being able to invest in the ability to build fabs here to fill what is likely a looming crisis for the semiconductor supply chain when China invades Taiwan. Why? Because the moment that an American shareholder starts engaging with its underlying companies with that message, they lose their license to be able to do business in China, which is their
how China has militarized capitalism is just an amazing story.
Actually, just give you another example, which is actually thinking of Chinese investments in the United States. Tell me if you already know this, but you probably own. I would venture to guess. Many people out there probably own or think they own companies like Alibaba or Tencent. I mean, these are some of the biggest tech companies in the world. They're included in many diversified funds. They trade on the New York Stock Exchange. So you think you own a share of Alibaba or Tencent? I got news for you. This is going to be a very rude awakening when it comes. You don't actually own shares of Alibaba or Tencent. In a quite literal sense, you don't. Because you know why? There's a Chinese law that says it is illegal for a non-Chinese national to own shares in a publicly traded Chinese technology company. So what do you actually own? BABA, I believe, is the ticker for Alibaba. So you think about the SEC and like its army of people that are pushing people for fraudulent advertising or whatever. I mean, this, if you're going to have that administrative apparatus, this might be a place you pay attention.